Good morning. Welcome back. We last left them. He was on the runway or tarmac of an airport, and Heidi in the plane saw him, and so did Mrs. Nutbush, who's his owner apparently. And Heidi unlatched the cage and took off. So here we are. Chapter 4. Moo. I'm Mrs. Beaglehole, said an enormous, elegant woman, whom Heidi mistook for a trained red cow. She stood stiffly just inside the airline terminal doorway. Hands clasped, figured Heidi about where her udder should be. Mrs. Beaglehole blinked rapidly and looked down at the girl. Miss Heidi McLeod, I presume? I now run your uncle's dog ranch. Welcome to Piddleton. She held out a long hand. Heidi reached for it carefully with her own while eyeing the woman's toothy mouth. Cows can attack. And there's Mrs. Beaglehole. And welcome to your new life, Mrs. Beaglehole said, folding her hands again. Your uncle is so very interested in seeing you again. Maybe with your hair brushed. How old were you again when you last visited him here? 13? 6, said Heidi. The woman snorted and pretended not to hear. He has great plans for you, you know. I don't like dogs, said Heidi. She thought she should put that out there early. Mrs. Beaglehole looked as if she'd been stuck with a knitting needle. Not like dogs? Why? Heidi looked back at the woman with equal shock. Did this ridiculous human ever really not know that it was because of dogs, that her parents had died when she was a little kid? That it was because of dogs that her criminally negligent uncle had dispatched her to stew with the mutant nuns at St. Egregious for all those torturous years? She didn't know that it was because of dogs that Heidi's life was now shredded like one of her stupid uncle's giant canvas chew toys? Apparently not, concluded Heidi. I don't like dogs, she said finally, because they always need a bath. Mrs. Beaglehole's smile tightened with annoyance and spread so wide that Heidi worried the ends of her mouth might stretch all the way around her neck and meet, allowing the mighty head to spring off and hit the ceiling. Dogs don't need baths here, said Mrs. Beaglehole. Unlike children. How you must be so looking forward to yours. Heidi stopped listening because she had noticed something peculiar about Mrs. Beaglehole as she talked. With her head cocked ever so slightly to the left, the woman had one eye closed and the other focused on the center of the girl's face. She was citing Heidi's nose for straightness, exactly like the blue-furred woman had looked at the dachshund. Heidi sighed and rolled her eyes. She looked past Mrs. Beaglehole and through the huge terminal windows, looking hard for the mountains of Fiji. But she didn't see Fiji outside. She saw the dachshund out of his crate, crouched at the base of a pile of luggage on the tarmac outside, waiting to lunge for freedom. A lion in the bush, thought Heidi, smiling. Her first smile that day. She watched the dog make a dash for the tarmac fence, but several workers cut him off, sending him into another group having lunch. His forward momentum took him straight up the leg of the first man, past his chest and up his face, which had several French fries sticking out of it. Dogs are creatures of survival, so he instinctively grabbed them all with his teeth as he climbed. Hooking a rear paw into the man's open mouth, he pushed himself onto the top of the man's head. The man flailed as if being attacked by a fruit bat. The other man grabbed for the dog, but then the escapee leapt to his head. Other workers ran up, and the dog kept leaping from head to head to head to head to head, and so forth. You might think these acrobatics enough to fully occupy a dog's attention, but no, they are multitaskers at their core, and he finished chewing the stolen French fries. His first French fries ever, as it happens. The dog licked his lips and made a mental note that his favorite thing in the world was no longer kibble. Inside the terminal, Mrs. Nutbush shrieked in horror at the sight of her Douglas dachshund escaping from the scalps of Piddleton's sweatiest luggage handlers. Heidi watched as the furred woman surged forward and body slammed through the glass security doors. Airport alarms erupted, as did Mrs. Nutbush. Get him! Get him! Don't touch the tuft! She yelled, arms out, hands waving, fur coat flapping. She got 20 feet before the first of a dozen security people tackled her, looking, Heidi thought, like the Notre Dame backfield piling atop a 200-pound blue rodent. There's a picture of it. Heidi gave a long, low whistle of awed admiration. "Some dog," she said aloud. "A stray, no doubt. Mongrel," snorted Mrs. Beaglehole. "Grubby, undisciplined mutts need a leash." As she mumbled this, she reached into her large purse and removed a dog leash. Heidi's eyes went large as the woman bent down toward Heidi's neck. She stopped, catching herself. "Old habit," she said, smiling that tight, lipless smile again. Mrs. Beaglehole picked up Heidi's bags and nudged Heidi out the front doors to a town car idling in front of the terminal, waiting to take her to the rest of her life. I feel like the camera's moving. Oops, sorry. Those are my legs. All right, chapter 5. Heidi settled nervously into the back seat as the car pulled away onto the airport road. She never saw the renegade dachshund behind her on the tarmac leap into the cab of an electric airport cart and accidentally hit the accelerator with his bottom. The little vehicle lurched forward and bounced below the belly of a parked airplane and on toward the runway. A dozen airport people chased the cart. A huge sign attached to its bumpers read, "Follow me." The dog wasn't actually steering, of course, but to his surprise, he found himself moving quickly away from Mrs. Nutbush, who was still flattened under the men on the tarmac. He kept his bottom pressed against the accelerator pedal and presumed, like a dog caught shredding and eating a designer sofa, that everything was going to be fine. The Follow Me vehicle entered the main runway from the side and directly across the path of a taxiing 737 airliner that had just landed from Dubuque. The little truck continued east across the grass toward the highway. The plane turned in the same direction and obediently followed close behind. Meanwhile, Heidi sat unhappily in the back of the huge car moving down the airport perimeter road while Mrs. Beaglehole drove. "Dear sweet Heidi," the woman said, "we should probably discuss something before you see your uncle. The wonderful ladies of St. Egregious mentioned some, problems there that you have been involved in." Heidi said nothing. Word must have gotten out about the flush reversals she had arranged for the nuns' bathrooms. She stared at the back of the car seats. Little golden retrievers were carved into the leather. "Your Uncle Hamish's spirit isn't terribly well, dear. We'd hate for any unnecessary stress to enter his life right now." Heidi looked out the window as the car moved away from the airport. She saw people on the sidewalk pointing back down the road behind them. Heidi twisted around in her seat and looked out the rear window. The little electric airport cart swerved close behind their bumper, the dachshund's face peeking out over the hood. Close behind the Follow Me cart rolled a 737 airliner and its obedient pilots moving down the country road. Mrs. Beaglehole stared straight ahead in the front seat and continued, "Heidi, I'll just ask you straight out. Can we expect any problems ahead?" Heidi stared behind her as the airliner's wings knocked down the power poles lining the road 20 yards back, sending sparks flying and exploding a small transformer box. "No," she said. On the weaving, bouncing electric cart, the dog spotted the girl peering at him through the car's rear window ahead of him. Amidst a troublesome day where nothing made sense, the girl's face was a lifeboat of familiarity. He leapt from the electric car's accelerator pedal, stopping it cold. The airliner behind it slammed on its brakes in front of a Piggly Wiggly grocery store, which the passengers decided was the Piddleton Airport baggage claim. The dachshund streaked up alongside Heidi's car, leapt onto the running board, and scrambled up the rear door, through the open window, and into Heidi's open travel bag tucked next to her leg. Panting hard, he looked up at the startled girl and said simply, "I love French fries." He honestly couldn't think of anything less stupid to say, but he thought something honest was called for. It was a pity that the girls don't speak dog. Heidi looked down in mute amazement. Then, with a single finger, Heidi gently, silently pushed the dachshund's muzzle into the bag and zipped it up. Ooh. Hold on, where are we at? 9 minutes? Okay. Chapter 6. Snort. "I remember this place like a dream," said Heidi, allowing a smile. She leaned over Mrs. Beaglehole's shoulder and peered out the town car's front window at the extraordinary sight ahead of her. The car had turned off a country road and into a tunnel made of dark canopy of great oak trees. As they emerged back into the sunlight, two 20-foot-high Great Danes made of shrubbery stood sentinel on either side of the final entrance to McLeod Heavenly Acres. The driveway pointed to the top of the highest hill for miles around, atop which stood the McLeod mansion, one of Heidi's faded memories from 8 years before. She let out a low whistle which made the renegade dachshund hiding in her bag stir. Whistles are to dogs what a pricked thumb is to a vampire. Heidi pushed her last taffy candy bar into the bag to quiet her stowaway. "Something's different," said Heidi, still staring out the window. She saw rows and rows of empty kennels in the near distance. The dogs are gone. "Your uncle seemed to lose interest in dogs after your parents were... Mrs. Beaglehole trailed off. "You can just come out and say it," said Heidi. "Eaten by schnauzers?" Mrs. Beaglehole spun around and gave the smirking girl the evil cow eye. The woman was shocked at her coolness toward her parents. Why not coolness? Heidi had never known her family, really. Her memories of her parents were like dim figures peeking out from a thick fog. All she had known for the last 8 years was a girls' school in the freezing hills of Minnesota and platoons of behemoth penguins pretending to be nuns. Mrs. Beaglehole continued, "Your uncle sold off all the beautiful dogs. All so beautiful. Like tossing out Louis Vuitton handbags." This was the first of many snorts of displeasure. Heidi read somewhere that water buffaloes snort before they ram people. Your Uncle Hamish now mostly spends his time alone. Doesn't seem interested in much of anything. I arrived a few years ago to take care of things while he..." She snorted. "He's not well, which is why he sent for you." This time Heidi snorted. She was going to demand the truth about her parents' deaths, and why her uncle had sent her away years ago. But she changed her mind. She looked at the rows of empty kennels passing by. "There aren't any dogs left here at all?" Mrs. Beaglehole brightened visibly. "Why, yes, dear. Mine. That makes one." Heidi felt her bag move as the dachshund chewed his first banana taffy. 2, thought Heidi. The car pulled up to the grand house's grand entrance, where Heidi's door was opened by a younger woman in a neat housekeeper's apron who didn't make Heidi think of cows at all. A quiet baby was slung tightly across her back in a sling. "Heidi McLeod, I'm Miss Violet. I look after your uncle's house, and the cooking, and my Bruno here, of course." She held up the baby's socked foot. Mrs. Beaglehole snorted. "It looks like an Indian papoose, Violet." Miss Violet took Heidi's hand and looked at her with a softness that she wasn't used to. "Your mother and I were good friends when we were girls. I used to play with her in this very house. And isn't it funny? Now I'm back looking after her brother." "Actually, Miss Violet, that is my job," injected Mrs. Beaglehole with an edge to her voice. "You see to lunch." Mrs. Beaglehole climbed onto a step leading to the front door, so that she was slightly higher than either of them. "Come along. Your uncle is waiting to see you. You're off a button with your sweater, dear." Heidi followed Mrs. Beaglehole into the entry. She gasped. Dark paneled walls soared to a ceiling 3 stories above her. Straight ahead, a grand staircase curved upward into darkness. In fact, the entire house was dark. But that's not what made the girl stop and stare. The dogs. Ghosts of McLeod family purebreds. The walls were covered with them. In huge paintings 8 feet tall, they sat rigid and regal, as if stunned into bewildered awe by the glory of their own fabulousness. A Bolivian flat-nosed Spittin' Spaniel, an orange-crested Dutch baby Deucenstrugel, a Chinese Kiss-and-Tellin Terrier, many more, far more exotic. Heidi let out another long, low whistle, which again made the dachshund hiding inside her bag across her shoulder stop, chewing the taffy, and reflexively blurt out, "What? Hello, I'm here. My tongue is stuck in the woof of my mouth." He said this in dog, of course, and it emerged as a garbled yip. Heidi heard it and tried to cover it up by shuffling a large chair next to her. Mrs. Beaglehole glanced about. "Moles," she sniffed. There were another set of ears nearby, however, far less easily fooled. A large poodle with a red bow came tearing in from the kitchen, barking maniacally. I heard that! Who was that? He yelled. Mrs. Beaglehole spun around and threw her arms wide. There's my darling champion to be. Heidi, this is Cassius. Heidi stared at the pathetic creature. Beach ball-sized explosions of furry hair erupted like creeping blobs of attacking white broccoli across the entirety of the starved beast's shaved skeleton. Is he gonna die? Asked Heidi. On the contrary, he's gonna win Westminster one day, said Mrs. Beaglehole, reaching down through miles of poodle fur and fluffing it up to an even more terrifying extent. Cassius turned to Mrs. Beaglehole with a lick to her nose. She thrust out a hand to stop him. Tut, tut, tut. No lickies, Cassius. You know I only on my feet and before bath time. I shall count the minutes until paradise, madam, mumbled the poodle, rolling his eyes. He looked around the room. He heard a yip. He knew a yip when he heard one, and it wasn't a stupid yard mole. He ate them all the time, and they never yipped. Unless, he thought, you started at the tail and went very slow. All right, so there's Heidi, and there's Cassius in the background. And there's me on top. Sorry. All right, let's see what we got here. If this is a short chapter, I'll do it. If not, I'm not. All right, I'll do it. Chapter 7. Poofed. Heidi, come on. Come to me, niece. A man's voice said from the darkness above the stairs. The girl froze. Then she moved to the source of the voice as commanded, climbing the stairs slowly. She peered into a vast, dark room. You got my letters? Asked the voice of Uncle Hamish somewhere in the black depths of a huge chair. Cassius stood nearby, eyes glowing like embers. Yep, got 'em, said Heidi, standing in the doorway unsmiling. You look like your mother, Heidi, said Hamish. Well, that's a relief, Uncle. People start looking like their dogs after enough time. She stared at her uncle. It's been 8 years. I figured I might start looking like the nuns. Hamish was silent for a moment. I know you're angry, Heidi, he finally said. He suddenly stood up into the firelight. He was still in his pajamas and his hair was long and mussed. I knew how to sight the slightest detour in the backbone of a Pukistan dingle hound from 200 feet. I could massage out the kinks from the curls of a crested Cape Town kinkapoodle. I knew how to nurse 20 puppies with 20 bottles with 2 hands and another 5 with my feet. Hamish pointed at Heidi. But I couldn't braid a 6-year-old girl's ponytail. I do my own braiding, said Heidi, not buying it for a second. He ran a hand through his hair. I'm sorry. Parenting you would have made as much sense as Cassius here herding sheep. The horror, said Cassius. The grass stains. Heidi felt the bag on her shoulder move. The dachshund wanted out. I do too, thought Heidi. So there's a picture of Uncle Hamish. If you look carefully, you gotta really slowly take a picture and take a look. Hamish collapsed back into his huge chair and put his face in his hands. He spoke quietly this time. It was me who dreamed of finding a champion Tibetan yak nibbler hound. It was my dream. But when the hot air balloon went down in the storm over the Himalayan mountains, it wasn't me in it. It was your parents. I had sent them instead. He looked up at the little girl. Me. It should have been me. Hamish looked empty. The dogs in the painting seemed to peer down at the rumpled man with cold judgment. I think I died too, Heidi. This was no longer a place for life, or show dogs, or little girls. He collected himself and stood again. But you're older now. There's something I want you to see. Hamish moved unsteadily toward the towering window, covered with a heavy curtain tapestry. All I want now is for you to stay. All this, McLeod Heavenly Acres, will be yours, soon. It's time you made it so. This house, this world, yours. Mine? Sputtered Heidi. She suddenly noticed Mrs. Beaglehole standing in one of the room's dark corners, listening and watching her carefully, quietly. Cassius sat next to her doing the same. The huge poodle rose and moved to Heidi, where he slipped his long, bony nose into her hand dangling at her side, so that her fingers cradled his chin. He looked up at her with coal black eyes. No, ours, said Cassius. She pulled her hand away. Hamish drew back the window curtains, flooding the room with dazzling sunlight. Heidi looked out the window and gasped. The entire population of Piddleton was in the backyard. Cars covered the nearby hills, brightly striped tents sat amidst the verdant gardens, and people milled about the sprawling lawn in their finest Sunday clothes. The women were festooned in sparkling bracelets and astonishingly large hats in the shape of inverted serving bowls. Men sported two-tone shoes and pressed cream trousers. Children chased each other and dropped ice cream onto lace-trimmed skirts. And each gloved hand held a leash, at the end of which was a strutting hound of traffic-stopping beauty, of brushed and curled and poofed fur glistening like woven gold, and noses and backbones aligned more perfectly than the pyramids of Egypt. The ancient oaks overhead seemed almost to bow at the sight of so much naked dog glamour passing below them. The pampered paws moved toward a central clearing on the lawn, around which hundreds of white folding chairs awaited the pressed linen bottoms of their proud owners. A woman with a clipboard stood waving in the center. It's a dog show, said Heidi, staring below, guessing correctly that it wasn't the spring tractor pull. The Piddleton Open, said her uncle without zeal. Held here at McLeod Heavenly Acres every year for the past 100. Go down there and dip in your toes. It's your new pond. Mine? Asked Heidi again, eyes wide, incredulous. She looked down into the rolling ocean of flowered hats and perfumed spaniels as she would lava. Are you coming with me, Uncle? She looked up to see that she was alone. Uncle? She whispered into the room's darkness. There was only silence. The firelight flickered on the faces of the dogs and the painting staring down, now, at her. All right, that's a wrap. Have a good day.